and it's called Mindsight by Dr. Daniel Siegel. It's a book which really talks about what your brain is doing when you do something. When you react or act a certain way, what process is your mind going through? And this is a big component of what mind-body medicine is, or understanding what mind-body medicine is, or how it works. And it really touches upon the neurobiological aspects of what's happening in the mind. It serves as a real focal point for healing, because the mind is strongly involved in, or the mind-body connection is really important to the healing process. They're not independent of each other. And if you can put yourself in the right frame of mind, so to speak, that can really help with healing and well-being overall. I'm not just talking about, chronic illnesses. Certainly the mind has a big role to, play in helping you heal and get better. But even what I think is more profound now is mental illness, which is a big issue and a growing issue in today's society with all the stressors that we encounter on a regular basis. And having the resiliency to deal with those sort of issues is really important, especially for students now who are bombarded by all kinds of different stressors, and external factors, COVID being, such a big one recently, affecting people's lives. So mind-body medicine has a big role to play in developing mental resiliency and hopefully coping with things like mental illness. If you think about the book I mentioned, Mindsight, one of the intros of the book is really just to give you an idea of how the brain is sort of structured and how it works. He really uses, and this is not my model by any means, this is Dr. Daniel Siegel's model, but he uses this model called the brain in your palm of your hand. And the way it works is, I can use my palm here to describe 3 different sections of the brain, right? So the brain stem, you consider the bottom base of my palm here. That's sort of your primal functions, eat, sleep, that sort of thing. My thumb will be the limbic system, which is sort of your main emotional generator, where your emotions sort of come from. And then if I put my 4 fingers on top of that, this part here is what we call the prefrontal cortex, or the front part of your brain right over here. And if you look at the structure of this thing, one important thing that you want to notice is that the prefrontal cortex is what helps to connect all 3 regions together. It touches on the brainstem, the limbic system, and the interaction between these 3 regions is really mediated by the prefrontal cortex, but maintaining the connections between them are really, really important. So why is this relevant or important when it comes to mindfulness or mind-body medicine? Well, the reason it's relevant is because if you look at meditative studies or mindfulness-based studies, where, for instance, they look at a group of people who start to meditate, and they look at, so for instance, the activity in the brain that's changed, one of the things that they will see is one of the areas of activation happen to be the prefrontal cortex. And there are a few other regions in here that are really important as well, including the angular cingulate cortex, or the ACC. Anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, which is serves as an interface. There's a small interface or layer between the limbic system and your prefrontal cortex. And so it's sort of when you feel an emotion, like rage or anger or whatever it might be, your ACC sort of takes it and sort of thinks about it and sort of processes it a little bit, and then sends the message to the prefrontal cortex, hey, this is what we're feeling, now what should we do, right? Now, when you think of someone who has, let's say, a mental illness or is coping with anxiety, depression, rage, personality disorder, those sort of things, a lot of it can stem from the limbic system. It's an emotional sort of generator where you react to your emotion right away, and you have really no control of how you react to that emotion. And so what you want to develop over time is the ability to take that emotion, think about it, and then react appropriately, as opposed to just sort of going in many different directions and your mind sort of taking, sort of thinking about all kinds of different things that will just add to your stress without actually trying to deal with maybe the problem you're facing. And so when you think about meditative studies, when I say that part of the prefrontal cortex, specifically the lateral prefrontal cortex, seems to be most activated or sort of strengthened, it sits on top of that limbic system, remember, and it touches upon this region. So it gives you the ability to really think about that emotion and process it, as opposed to doing this, which in Daniel Siegel's book he calls flipping the lid, right? Think about a really simple example is road rage. Someone cuts you off in the middle of the street, first thing that you want to do is probably say a few colorful choice words and really let out your anger. And in some cases, you've seen some YouTube videos, people get out of their car and do all kinds of things that they probably shouldn't have done. But that's usually what you call flipping your lid. You didn't think about your emotions or process them or think about the consequences. Now, someone who's a little bit more grounded or perhaps practices something like mindfulness, their prefrontal cortex is going to take that emotion, think about it for a second, and maybe you do let out a few choice colorful words and you keep driving. And that's the difference. It's having that be able to control your emotion and regulate your emotions in a better way, and opposed to taking the path which will lead to those severe consequences or strengthen networks in your brain that will lead to depression, anxiety. What you're doing is you're moving away from those neuronal pathways, and you're trying to strengthen the pathways that make you more resilient and react in a better way. And there are really two terms that really describe that really well. One is neuroplasticity and one is neurogenesis. And for a lot of cases, if you look at people with mental illnesses like anxiety or depression, they've reinforced those negative pathways, those neuronal maps and connections, dealing or reacting in the same way over and over again without a way of sort of really thinking about it and processing it. They've strengthened that pathway continuously. So every time they run into a stress or something that causes them anxiety, they go down the same path and they react in the same way, and it just perpetuates and it continually builds. And so you need to, mindfulness or meditation, it's been shown a way, by sort of strengthening those connections. He calls it vertical integration in this sense. It helps to, sort of create those new positive pathways, positive neurogenesis, and change in the brain. For a long time, we thought the brain couldn't change. Once we were born and our map was already made out. And that's certainly not the truth anymore. Certainly science has shown now that we can change those pathways and we can change the way our brain maps form. And we have something called neuroplasticity, which is really important to that. So PTSD, in terms of the mechanism of how that works, and Dr. Daniel Siegel actually talks about in his book as well. This was vertical integration. He also talks about something called memory integration, which is certainly connected to trauma or things like PTSD. So one of the things that happens when you go through a traumatic moment in your life is that you have the ability, obviously, to record what is happening, right? Your memory. And you have what we call implicit memory and explicit memory. So during the time something is happening, so the memory that's always sort of working is the implicit memory. It's always taking in all the information around you and recording that information. Not all of it gets processed at the same time, but your mind's taking it all in. And so certainly when you're going through a traumatic moment, all of that is being recorded. Now, usually what happens is that implicit memory gets filed eventually into what we call the explicit memory. And so it becomes a past event, right? But when you're going through a traumatic event, one of the things that happens actually is things like cortisol and adrenaline are released, which is a stress response. Because of that chemical release, what tends to happen is the change from implicit memory to explicit memory gets compromised. And the implicit never gets transferred to the explicit. So what happens is it never becomes a past event. The moment you start thinking about that event again, it's like it's happening in the real time because it never got filed away. And so one of the things that, a mindfulness-based exercise that he actually talks about is sort of integrating memory, helping you to go from that implicit memory to your explicit memory. And he talks about what he calls a dual focus of attention with his patients, where he actually sits down with them and he takes them through the event. Now certainly that's traumatic for them at the time, but he serves as the anchor point. That's not happening now, that's happening in the past. And usually what you do have to think about is some type of safe retreating place. Some place that makes you feel good, whether it be a beach or a great memory with a family member, whatever it might be. Something you can anchor yourself to say, no, I'm in the here and the now, I'm thinking about this happy moment as opposed to reliving that past event here and the now. And so that's a different way of dealing with trauma. Or using mindfulness-based techniques to deal with trauma. And it's really interesting, again, that's sort of what we call memory integration. I talked about vertical integration, and he also talks about something called horizontal integration, which builds on things like personality disorders, people who seem very sort of left-brained, who are very sort of certainly rational thinking, but they can't really process emotion very well. Think of, sometimes children with autism or autistic people are very much like that. They can't really relate to how someone else is feeling, which makes it difficult for them to interact with others and socialize with each other. And so one of the things he talks about is horizontal integration, where it's how can we help that right side of the brain, the more emotional, relating type of part of the brain. How can we help that? And he goes through some exercises where, for instance, you watch TV with the sound off, and you just try to relate to what the person is feeling and try to interpret what the person is feeling without actually hearing them speak. Or journaling, everyday journaling, what's happening in your life and how that made you feel, and really trying to strengthen that part of the brain, so again, you're able to relate better to others.